They thought they could fire me and let AI handle my job, but they never imagined that the very code they dismissed would become their undoing. You won't believe how I turned their precious AI into a self-destructing machine that brought the entire company to its knees. This is my story of how arrogance met its match in the depths of a server room. The server room hummed with the familiar rhythm I'd known for 20 years. Down here, 3 floors below ground, the air tasted of recycled coolant and old metal, while the cloud warriors worked in their glass offices 40 floors up. I lived among the actual machines that kept Veriton Capital's trillion-dollar operations alive. My name is Amelia Carter, and at 42, I'd become invisible to the executives who walked past me in the hallways. Just another middle-aged woman in practical shoes and a company polo, carrying a laptop older than their latest intern. They didn't know that I held the keys to their kingdom in my head, memorized through 2 decades of midnight emergencies and system crashes. That morning started like any other. The core authentication server had thrown another fit at 3 a.m., triggering my phone's emergency alert. By the time the first traders arrived at 6 a.m., I'd already patched the vulnerability, updated the failsafes, and documented the fix in my personal notebook. The official documentation system had been upgraded so many times that half the critical processes existed only in my handwritten notes. The irony wasn't lost on me as I heard laughter from the executive conference room above. Through the ventilation system, fragments of conversation drifted down revolutionary AI integration, workforce optimization, legacy system redundancies. They spoke about my servers like they were discussing old furniture to be thrown out. I pulled up the system diagnostics on my screen. The authentication module I'd built from scratch still processed over 3 million transactions daily without a hiccup. The load balancer I'd configured handled traffic spikes that would crash most modern cloud solutions. But none of that mattered to people who measured value in PowerPoint slides and buzzwords. My colleague Marcus appeared at the door, his young face creased with worry. "Amelia, they're bringing in consultants from Neural Flow Systems next week. Something about an AI overhaul." I kept my eyes on the screen, watching the familiar cascade of green status lights. "Let them come," I said quietly. "These systems have survived every upgrade attempt for the past decade." What I didn't tell Marcus was that I'd already noticed the signs. Access logs showed HR poking around employee records at odd hours. My parking spot had been reassigned to visitor status in next month's allocation. The writing wasn't just on the wall, it was carved into the very foundation of the building. But they'd forgotten something crucial. In their rush to embrace the future, they'd never asked who actually held the keys to the past. And in a system built on 20 years of patches, workarounds, and undocumented dependencies, the past had a way of reaching forward to strangle the future. I closed my notebook and locked it in my desk drawer. Inside were the only existing diagrams of how our authentication system really worked, hand-drawn and annotated over years of modifications. The official documentation showed a clean, logical flow. My diagrams showed the truth, a maze of dependencies that I navigated by instinct and memory. Above me, the executives continued their planning, blissfully unaware that they were plotting to remove the only person who knew where all the bodies were buried in their digital infrastructure. They thought AI could learn what I knew. They thought intelligence could replace intuition, that processing power could substitute for 2 decades of accumulated knowledge. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The changes started subtly, like scratches before an avalanche. First, my name disappeared from the weekly maintenance schedule. Then, my access to the executive status reports vanished overnight. No explanation, no email, just a polite, access denied message where critical information used to live. I'd survived 4 CEOs, 3 major mergers, and countless digital transformations. I knew how to read the corporate weather. This felt different. This felt final. On Tuesday, Derek from the help desk started shadowing me, fresh out of college, eager to please, and asking questions about systems he'd never shown interest in before. "Just want to understand the infrastructure better," he said, fumbling with his tablet while I worked on a critical patch. "Why the sudden interest in 20-year-old cron jobs?" I asked, not looking up from my terminal. His nervous laugh told me everything. "Oh, professional development. Good to understand the whole stack." I showed him the surface level, the pretty documentation that meant nothing without context. When he asked about the authentication handshake between our legacy systems and the trading platform, I smiled and pulled out a diagram. This one's not in the system, hand-drawn, more accurate that way. His eyes lit up like he'd found gold. I let him photograph it with his phone, knowing he was missing the crucial annotations I'd written in pencil, too faint for his camera to capture. Those notes explained the timing delays, the specific sequence of challenges and responses that kept our house of cards standing. Wednesday brought more shadows. Its security performed an audit of my workspace, cataloging every piece of equipment, every manual, every personal item. They smiled too much, avoided eye contact, and left with clipboards full of notes. In the server room, I ran my hands along the familiar racks. Server 23B had a temperamental fan that needed a specific tap to stop its whining. The backup authentication server required a full minute between power cycles, or it would corrupt its certificate store. Thousands of these quirks lived in my muscle memory. Impossible to document, impossible to transfer. That evening, I stayed late and did something I'd never done before. I walked through the entire infrastructure, mentally cataloging every undocumented dependency, every creative solution I'd implemented over the years. The authentication system alone had 43 separate modules, each with its own personality, its own requirements, its own secrets. The genius of my system wasn't in its elegance, it was in its perfect imperfection. Like a jazz improvisation, it worked because I knew exactly when to bend the rules, when to let certain processes lag, when to manually intervene. It was a living thing, breathing with the rhythm of 20 years of patches and workarounds. On Thursday, they made their first real mistake. Someone tried to access my personal documentation folder on the network, triggering an alert I'd set up years ago. The attempt came from an HR terminal at 2 a.m. They weren't even trying to hide it anymore. I printed out 30 pages of system diagrams that night, but not the real ones. These were clean, simplified versions that looked complete, but omitted the crucial timing sequences, the dependency chains, the manual overrides that kept everything running. I left them prominently on my desk, bait for whoever was preparing to take over. Friday morning, I found Derek at my workstation when I arrived. "Oh, hey Amelia. Just wanted to review those cron jobs again. Hope you don't mind." I watched him studying my decoy documentation, taking pictures, making notes. "Find everything you need." "This is incredible," he said. "So organized, so clear." I smiled, remembering the advice my mentor gave me 20 years ago. The best security isn't a lock, it's making sure you're the only one who knows there's a door. They thought they were stealing my knowledge. In reality, I was letting them steal exactly what I wanted them to have, just enough information to be dangerous, not enough to be successful. That afternoon, I quietly removed 3 critical configuration files from the documentation system and replaced them with older versions. The differences were subtle, a few environment variables, some timeout values, things that would only matter under heavy load. I kept the originals on a USB drive attached to my keychain. As I prepared to leave that evening, I looked back at the server room one last time. They had no idea what they were about to lose. In their arrogance, they'd assumed that intelligence could be automated, that 20 years of intuition could be replaced by algorithms. They were about to receive an education in humility, delivered by the very machines they thought they understood. The email arrived at 4:47 p.m. on Friday, precisely 13 minutes before the end of my shift. The timing was deliberate, too late to make a scene, too early to claim they'd waited until after hours. The subject line read, "Employment Status Update." I didn't need to open it to know what it contained, but I did anyway. The language was corporate sterile, probably generated by the same AI they thought would replace me. After careful consideration of our operational needs, position has been eliminated. We thank you for your service. 20 years reduced to 3 paragraphs of legalese. No human signature, just Veritan Capital Human Resources Department and a digital timestamp. I read it twice, then deleted it. No point keeping digital souvenirs of corporate cowardice. Around me, the office hummed with typical Friday energy. People making weekend plans, discussing dinner reservations, living their lives while mine was being erased. Nobody met my eyes. They all knew. The corporate grapevine had been warning them to keep their distance from the dead woman walking. I had 2 hours to clear out my workspace, Security would escort me out, standard procedure for anyone with system access. They'd already disabled my email, my calendar, even my cafeteria payment chip. I was being digitally erased in real time. The desk drawer unlocked with a small key I'd carried for 15 years. Inside, my personal notebook lay waiting. 2 decades of troubleshooting notes, system passwords, and hand-drawn network diagrams. The real documentation, the truth behind the digital facade. I lifted it carefully, feeling its familiar weight. Then I slipped it into my bag, along with a small USB drive that contained something even more valuable, the root encryption keys for the legacy authentication system. Not the current ones, those were backed up in triplicate. These were the master keys, the ones generated when the system was first built, the ones nobody remembered existed because I'd never documented them. My personal items fit into a single box: a coffee mug from the company's 10th anniversary, a stress ball shaped like a server, a photograph of the original IT team. All long gone except for me. I left the company laptop on the desk, wiped clean except for the standard software. Let them wonder what happened to my personal scripts and utilities. Security arrived exactly at 5 p.m., 2 guards I'd never seen before, wearing the blank expressions of people just doing their job. "Ms. Carter, we're here to escort you out." Of course you are. The walk to the elevator felt endless. Passing colleagues suddenly found their phones fascinating, their screens urgently important. Only Marcus had the courage to look up, his face a mixture of guilt and fear. He'd be fine. He was young, adaptable, everything they valued. He just didn't know what he didn't know. In the elevator, one of the guards cleared his throat. "Nothing personal, ma'am. Just procedure." I know, and I did. I'd written part of that procedure myself, back when security protocols were more than checkbox exercises. The lobby stretched before us, marble and glass and corporate ambition. Through the windows, I could see the November rain starting, drops streaking the glass like tears the building couldn't cry. My car waited in the parking garage, already reassigned to visitor status starting Monday. At the security desk, they took my badge, my parking pass, my corporate credit card. Each item disappeared into a manila envelope, another piece of my identity stripped away. The guard handed me a receipt, as if I'd ever want to claim these tokens of my erasure. "That's everything," he said, not meeting my eyes. "Not everything," I replied, thinking of the notebook in my bag, the USB drive in my pocket, the 20 years of knowledge in my head. Outside, the rain had intensified. I stood under the building's overhang, watching employees stream past, heading for their weekends, their lives unchanged. On Monday, they'd return to find the infrastructure still running, the servers still humming, and they'd assume everything was fine. They wouldn't notice the subtle changes I'd made in my final week. The backup schedules shifted by just a few minutes. The log rotation scripts tweaked to archive slightly less data. The monitoring thresholds adjusted to be a little less sensitive. Tiny changes, invisible under normal conditions. But Veritan Capital was about to enter conditions that were anything but normal. My phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. "Amelia, this is Jim from Neural Flow. We'll be taking over your systems Monday. Derek says you left excellent documentation. Thanks for making this transition smooth." I typed back, "Happy to help. Good luck with the deployment." Then I blocked the number and walked to my car, my notebook heavy in my bag. My conscience remarkably light. They wanted to replace me with artificial intelligence. They were about to discover the value of the real thing. The rain followed me home, washing away my tire tracks from the parking garage, erasing the last physical evidence of my presence. But deep in the basement, in the servers I'd nursed for 2 decades, my ghost remained, waiting in the spaces between the code, in the undocumented dependencies, in the legacy systems that nobody else understood. They'd sent me away with an automated email. I'd left them with an automated nightmare. Monday arrived with the kind of crisp November morning that made everything seem possible. From my apartment window, I watched the city wake up, knowing that 3 miles away, Veritan Capital was about to experience a very different kind of awakening. My laptop showed the news feeds, all breathless excitement about Veritan's revolutionary AI integration. The press release had dropped at 6 a.m. Veriton Capital leads financial sector with advanced neural network trading platform. The CEO was quoted extensively about efficiency, innovation, and leaving outdated systems behind. I made coffee and waited. The first signs appeared on the internal status page I still had bookmarked. They'd forgotten to revoke my read-only access to the public monitoring dashboard, a typically sloppy oversight. At 9:15 a.m., right as the markets opened, the authentication response time started climbing. 5 milliseconds, 10, 20. To the AI, everything looked normal. Response times were within acceptable parameters. All systems showed green. But I knew better. Those legacy authentication servers weren't just slow. They were entering a cascade state I'd seen only twice before. Both times, I'd been there to catch it. This time, I was drinking coffee in my pajamas. The neural flow AI was sophisticated. I had to admit, it detected the slowdown and began optimizing, rerouting authentication requests, load balancing across the server farm, textbook responses to a textbook problem. But this wasn't a textbook. At 9:47 a.m., the AI made its first critical error. Following its optimization protocols, it began caching authentication tokens to reduce server load. Smart move. Except for one small detail, I'd never documented our legacy system used rolling tokens that invalidated cached copies after exactly 11024 authentication cycles. Why 11024? Because 20 years ago, that seemed like a number nobody would ever hit in a single session. The AI hit it in 12 minutes. Suddenly, every cached token became invalid simultaneously. The AI, confused but undeterred, tried to refresh them all at once. 10,000 simultaneous authentication requests hit the legacy servers, each one requiring a full handshake cycle. In my old notebook, the one now locked in my home safe, I'd written a warning: never exceed 100 concurrent auth requests. Server 23B will lock all mutex threads if overwhelmed. The AI didn't have my notebook. I watched the status board light up like a Christmas tree. Yellow warnings became orange alerts, became red critical errors. But the AI kept trying. Its machine learning algorithms detecting patterns that didn't exist, optimizing solutions to problems it didn't understand. By 10:15 a.m., my phone started buzzing. Unknown numbers I didn't answer, then known numbers I also didn't answer. Finally, a text from Marcus. "Amelia, something's wrong with the auth system. Can you please call back?" I turned off my phone. The beautiful thing about AI is its confidence. It doesn't second-guess itself, doesn't have intuition, doesn't know when to stop digging when it's in a hole. The neural flow system saw the authentication bottleneck and decided the solution was more aggressive optimization. It began predictive caching, trying to anticipate which tokens would be needed next. But our legacy system had another quirk: prediction patterns triggered its fraud detection. Too many correct guesses in a row looked like a brute force attack. The system started adding delays, exponential backoffs that the AI interpreted as hardware failures. So the AI did what it was trained to do. It started migrating services away from the failing hardware. By 11 a.m., the entire authentication system was in full defensive mode, treating the AI as a hostile attacker. Every request was delayed, challenged, and re-challenged. The AI, convinced it was dealing with a massive DDoS attack, activated its own defensive measures. Veriton Capital's revolutionary AI had gone to war with itself. The trading floor must have been chaos. Without authentication, no trades could process. Client accounts couldn't be accessed. The entire financial infrastructure of one of the nation's largest investment firms ground to a halt, all while the AI insisted everything was under control, just experiencing temporary optimization delays. I made myself a sandwich and turned on the financial news. The anchors were puzzled by Veriton's sudden trading silence. Stock price dropping, rumors flying. The press release from this morning now reading like prophecy. They'd certainly left their outdated systems behind. They just hadn't arrived anywhere else. At 11:47 a.m., I got an email to a personal account they didn't know about. Jim from Neural Flow. Panic barely contained in professional language. "Ms. Carter, we're experiencing some integration challenges. Would you be available for a consultation call?" I waited an hour before responding. "I'm no longer with Veriton Capital. Best of luck with your deployment." The status board showed the final phase beginning. With the authentication system in full lockdown, the AI made the only logical decision: a complete system restart. It began gracefully shutting down services, preparing for a clean reboot that would surely solve all problems. Except nobody had told it about the 45-minute cold start procedure for the legacy systems, or the specific sequence required to bring servers online without corrupting the certificate store, or the fact that server 23B needed that specific tap on its fan housing to stop the vibration that would trigger thermal shutdown. As I watched the last status indicator go dark, I raised my coffee mug in a silent toast to 20 years of job security through obscurity. They thought they were replacing institutional knowledge with artificial intelligence. Instead, they'd replaced understanding with assumption, intuition with algorithm, and wisdom with processing power. And now, $30 million worth of AI was about to learn what I'd known all along: some problems can't be solved by intelligence alone. Sometimes, you just need to know where to tap. Tuesday morning brought the kind of perfect storm that financial newspapers dream about. Veritan Capital in crisis, screamed the Wall Street Journal. Investors locked out as trading platform fails, announced Bloomberg. The screenshots were everywhere: error messages, frozen screens, and that particularly damning image of Veritan's CEO being escorted through a crowd of angry clients. I watched it all unfold from my couch, wrapped in the quilt my grandmother made, feeling strangely detached from the chaos I'd set in motion. The news anchors spoke in breathless tones about billions in frozen assets, about regulatory investigations, about the hubris of replacing human expertise with artificial intelligence. They had no idea how right they were. My laptop showed the internal status page, still miraculously accessible. The neural flow AI had been trying to restart the system for 18 hours straight. Each attempt failed in new and creative ways. Without the proper startup sequence, the legacy servers refused to initialize. Without authentication, the trading platform couldn't verify transactions. Without transactions, Veritan Capital was just an expensive office building full of very worried people. The phone calls had stopped around 3 a.m. Even desperation has its limits, but the emails kept coming, each more frantic than the last. Jim from NeuralFlow, the CTO, the CEO himself, even members of the board, their usually impeccable grammar crumbling under pressure. Name your price. One email read, "Whatever consulting fee you want, just please help us restore service." I didn't respond. They needed to marinate in their own urgency a little longer. By noon, the situation had escalated beyond corporate disaster into full regulatory nightmare. The SEC announced an investigation. Client lawsuits were being filed by the hour. Veritan's stock price had dropped 40% in pre-market trading. The beautiful AI-powered future they'd promised was eating itself alive on live television. Marcus texted me from his personal phone. "Amelia, they're talking about criminal negligence. The FBI is here. Please, if you know anything that could help." Poor Marcus, still believing this was all some terrible accident, some unforeseen interaction between old and new systems. He didn't understand that every failure had been precisely orchestrated, every collapse exactly timed. I pulled out my notebook and flipped to a page marked "Disaster Recovery." My handwriting from 10 years ago outlined exactly how to bring the system back online. The sequence was specific, unforgiving, and completely undocumented in any system Veritan could access. Even if they guessed some steps, missing just one would restart the entire cascade of failures. The news switched to a live press conference. Veritan's CEO stood at a podium, his usually perfect appearance showing cracks. Wrinkled shirt, shadowed eyes, the look of a man who'd discovered his golden parachute had no ripcord. "We are working around the clock to restore normal operations," he said, reading from prepared notes. "Our team of experts." A reporter interrupted. "Sir, is it true you fired your entire legacy IT department last week to make room for the AI system?" The pause told the entire story. "We made strategic personnel decisions to optimize our technological infrastructure, including firing Amelia Carter, who maintained these systems for 20 years. I sat up straighter. How did they know my name? The CEO's jaw tightened. "We don't comment on individual personnel matters." But the damage was done, within minutes. My LinkedIn inbox exploded. Reporters, competitors, headhunters, all connecting dots. The narrative was writing itself. Hubris-filled executives fire veteran employee. Replace her with AI. Watch empire crumble. By 3 p.m., someone leaked internal emails to TechCrunch. The smoking guns were all their discussions about eliminating legacy personnel, projections of cost savings from AI-driven maintenance, dismissive comments about outdated employees clinging to obsolete systems. One email particularly stood out. From the CTO to the board, Carter's knowledge is fully documented. The AI has ingested all system specifications. Her departure will be seamless. Seamless? I laughed hard enough to spill coffee on my quilt. The final twist came at 4:17 p.m. A junior developer at Veriton, someone I'd never met, posted on Twitter. Fun fact, our authentication system was patented by A. Carter in 2019. Guess who owns those patents personally? Not through the company. My phone immediately exploded with calls from Veriton's legal department. They'd just discovered what I'd known for years. The core authentication logic they were desperately trying to restore was my intellectual property. I developed it on my own time, filed the patents myself, and licensed it to Veriton under an agreement that terminated with my employment. They weren't just locked out of their system, they were legally prohibited from fixing it without my permission. I let the phone ring and made myself dinner. Outside my window, November rain turned to sleet. Each drop another second of downtime, another million in losses, another career destroyed by the belief that intelligence could be artificial, but respect had to be earned. The evening news led with Veriton's collapse. Estimated losses had reached $3 billion. Trading partners were severing relationships. The SEC had frozen their assets pending investigation. The company that had stood for a century was dying in real time, killed by efficiency, strangled by optimization. And at the center of it all, an AI system still cheerfully trying to solve a puzzle it couldn't understand, like a child attempting calculus without knowing how to count. My grandmother's quilt was warm around my shoulders as I watched the city lights flicker in the rain. Somewhere in that glittering maze, executives were learning what I'd always known: respect isn't a legacy system you can replace. It's the foundation everything else builds on. And when you tear out the foundation to save a few dollars, you shouldn't be surprised when the whole house comes crashing down. The lakeside cabin had been my escape plan for years, tucked into the mountains of North Carolina. No cell service, satellite internet I could control, and a view that reminded me why I'd saved every penny for 2 decades. I'd arrived Wednesday morning, just as Veriton's second day of downtime was making international headlines. From my deck, I watched the morning mist rise off the lake while checking my laptop. The financial news was brutal. Veriton's stock had been suspended from trading. The Department of Justice had joined the SEC investigation. Clients were fleeing to competitors, taking billions in assets with them. The mighty Veriton capital was bleeding out in high definition. My satellite phone, the only number I'd given to exactly 3 people, rang at precisely 10 a.m. Ms. Carter. The voice was different from any I'd heard before. Older, calmer, with the weight of real authority. This is Harrison Blackstone. I'm the chairman of Veriton's board. I'd researched Blackstone years ago. Old money, old power. The kind of man who usually stayed in shadows while CEOs took the spotlight. If he was calling personally, the situation was even worse than the news suggested. Mr. Blackstone, I acknowledged, watching an eagle circle over the lake. I'll skip the pleasantries. Ms. Carter, we need you. The company needs you. 20,000 employees need you. More importantly, 3 million clients need access to their assets. That sounds like a Veriton problem, not an Amelia problem. His sigh carried decades of boardroom battles. What do you want? I'd been preparing for this question since I'd walked out of the building. First, let's discuss what you want. You need the authentication system restored. You need the trading platform operational. You need someone who understands the Byzantine maze of dependencies your AI can't navigate. Yes, all of that. Name your price. It's not just about price, Mr. Blackstone. Let's start with the patents. Your legal team has discovered that I own the core authentication methodology. Any attempt to restore the system without my involvement would be intellectual property theft. Our lawyers say that's arguable. I laughed. Your lawyers also said firing me would be seamless. How's that working out? Silence. Then what are your terms? I pulled out a handwritten list, not because I needed it, every demand was burned into my memory, but because the ritual felt appropriate. $25 million, cash, not stock options in your burning company, deposited in escrow before I write a single line of code. I'm not finished. Full public apology from the CEO, acknowledging that the decision to replace human expertise with AI was flawed. Reinstatement of all legacy IT staff who were terminated in the last month with full back pay and a 20% raise. The CEO has already resigned, Blackstone said quietly, as of this morning. That gave me pause. I hadn't seen that news yet. Then from whoever's in charge, the apology stands. What else? Independent contractor status, no exclusivity, no non-compete, no corporate oversight. I fix your disaster, then I walk away clean. And Mr. Blackstone, I want it all in writing, reviewed by my lawyers, before I even tell you the first step to recovery. He was quiet for a long moment. In the background, I could hear muffled voices, urgent conversations. The board was probably sitting around their mahogany table, watching their empire burn while debating my demands. You realize, he said finally, that you're holding the global financial system hostage. No, Mr. Blackstone, I'm holding a mirror up to corporate arrogance. You chose to replace 20 years of expertise with 6 months of algorithms. You chose to value innovation over infrastructure. I'm just setting a fair price for undoing your choices. $25 million is not fair. It's extortion. I stood up, walking to the edge of my deck. The lake was perfectly still, reflecting the clouded sky like glass. Let me explain what's fair. Fair would have been a conversation before you eliminated my position. Fair would have been asking about dependencies before deploying your AI. Fair would have been treating my knowledge as an asset instead of a liability. We made mistakes. No, you made choices. Choices have consequences. Your consequence costs $25 million and a public admission of failure. Considering your company loses that much every hour the system is down, I'd say I'm giving you a bargain. More muffled conversation. I could imagine the scene board members calculating losses, lawyers debating liability, everyone finally understanding that their digital transformation had transformed them into a cautionary tale. I need to discuss this with the board, Blackstone said finally. You have 6 hours. After that, my price goes up by $5 million for every additional day of downtime. Oh, and Mr. Blackstone, don't bother trying to hack around the problem. I've watched your AI fail for 2 days straight. Every attempt makes the system lock down harder. You planned this. It wasn't a question. I prepared for this. There's a difference. I spent 20 years building systems that worked. When you decided those systems and I were obsolete, I simply stopped preventing them from showing their true nature. That's sabotage. That's expertise. The system is working exactly as designed. It just turns out the design required more than artificial intelligence to maintain. It required actual intelligence, the kind you can't download or optimize or replace with neural networks. I hung up before he could respond. Let them stew in their boardroom, watching millions evaporate while debating the value of knowledge they dismissed as obsolete. 3 hours later, the satellite phone rang again. This time, I let it go to voicemail. The message was brief. We accept your terms. Legal documents will be sent within the hour. I smiled, pouring myself a glass of wine from the bottle I'd been saving for a special occasion. Outside, the eagle had caught something, carrying its prize back to its nest. Nature's successful negotiation, written in talons and instinct. The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent $50 million on an AI system to replace me. They were about to spend $25 million more to bring me back. $75 million to learn what any junior developer could have told them for free. You can't optimize away experience. Can't algorithm around intuition. Can't machine learn wisdom. My laptop chimed with an encrypted email. 40 pages of legal documents. Everything I'd demanded spelled out in exacting detail. I forwarded it to my lawyer and went back to watching the lake. Somewhere in New York, the brightest minds in finance were learning the oldest lesson in technology: respect the legacy systems, but respect the people who understand them even more. I returned to Veritan Capital at exactly midnight on Friday. 1 week after they'd escorted me out. The timing was deliberate markets closed, building empty except for security and the skeleton crew of engineers who'd been failing to fix the system for 4 days straight. The lobby felt different in darkness. All that marble and glass looked less impressive, more like a mausoleum for corporate ambition. Security had my new credentials ready, independent technical consultant, with access levels that made their eyes widen. For the next 72 hours, I had more power in this building than the CEO ever dreamed of. The elevator descended to the basement, each floor marking another step back into my domain. When the doors opened to the server room, I paused. The familiar hum was wrong discordant, struggling, like an orchestra trying to play without a conductor. The neural flow team was there, 5 engineers hunched over laptops, surrounded by empty energy drink cans and the smell of desperation. They looked up as I entered, hope and resentment battling in their exhausted faces. "Gentlemen," I said, setting down my old leather bag. "I'm Amelia Carter. I'll be taking over now." Jim from Neural Flow started to speak, probably to defend his system or explain their efforts. I held up a hand. "I've been watching your attempts for 4 days. I know exactly what you've tried and why it failed. What I need from you now is silence and space." They exchanged glances but began packing up. As they filed past, Jim muttered, "The documentation was wrong." "No," I corrected. "The documentation was incomplete. There's a difference." Alone at last, I walked through the server rows like a gardener surveying winter damage. My fingers traced familiar paths, noting which systems were in cascade failure, which were locked in defensive mode, which were simply confused by contradictory commands from an AI that didn't speak their language. I pulled out my leather bag and removed 3 items: my original notebook, the USB drive with the master keys, and a thermos of coffee made exactly how I liked it. The company could pay $25 million, but they couldn't make decent coffee. Starting with server 23B, I began the resurrection. First, the physical reset, not the power button that would just trigger another failed restart cycle. Instead, I opened the case and disconnected the tertiary power supply for exactly 12 seconds, an undocumented feature I discovered during a thunderstorm 15 years ago. The server's lights flickered, then steadied into a pattern I recognized: manual recovery mode. Next, the master keys. The USB drive contained more than just passwords. It held the original certificate chains, the root authorities that every other security measure traced back to. I connected it to the isolated terminal and began typing commands from memory. No documentation needed. These sequences were carved into my neurons by thousands of repetitions. The first authentication server accepted the keys like a lock, recognizing its original key after years of copies. Green lights began replacing red, but slowly, carefully. I'd learned long ago that rushing a recovery only created new problems. By 2 a.m., I had 4 core servers operational. The Neural Flow AI was still trying to optimize them, sending requests and corrections based on its training. I pulled up its interface and typed a single command: suspend all operations. The AI protested, throwing warnings about system efficiency and optimization protocols. I added a second command: priority override, human expert mode. For the first time in 4 days, the server room fell into its proper rhythm. Without the AI's constant interference, the legacy systems began to remember their purpose, their patterns, their protocols. I moved to the authentication cluster, where the real challenge waited. The token generation system had locked itself into a recursive loop, each server waiting for validation from another in an endless circle of distrust. The AI had tried to break the loop with force. I chose finesse. Opening my notebook to a page marked Byzantine Generals, I found the solution I'd written after a similar failure in 2018. Not a full system restart, but a carefully choreographed dance of partial resets, each server brought online in a specific sequence with precise timing. Server A first, waiting for the third LED to blink amber, then server C never B. That was the trap everyone fell into. Server E came next, but only after manually clearing its cache using a command line tool I'd written that existed on no documentation because it technically violated security protocols. As each server joined the dance, I felt the system's heartbeat strengthening. This wasn't computer science. This was art, intuition, 20 years of accumulated wisdom flowing through my fingers into the machines. By 4 a.m., the authentication system was breathing again, not fully operational, but alive enough to begin accepting the backed-up requests that had been queuing for days. I watched the first successful transaction process. A simple balance inquiry that would have been invisible on any normal day, but now felt like watching the first sunrise after a nuclear winter. The trading platform came next. This was the delicate part: millions of transactions frozen mid-process, each one a potential lawsuit if handled incorrectly. The AI had tried to process them all simultaneously. I knew better. I implemented what I called the trickle resurrection, processing transactions in small batches. Oldest first, with manual verification of each batch before proceeding. It would take hours, but it would be accurate. More importantly, it would be defensible in the inevitable investigations. As dawn light began filtering through the ventilation grates, I stood back and surveyed my work. The status board showed green across all critical systems. The authentication servers hummed their familiar song. The trading platform processed its steady rhythm of transactions. But I wasn't done, not yet. I pulled up the AI's core configuration and began typing. Not destroying it, that would be petty. Instead, I was teaching it. Every quirk I'd memorized, every undocumented feature, every personality trait of our ancient servers. I wrote them all into its learning matrix. Comments included. Never run more than 100 concurrent auth requests. Server 23B requires manual intervention for fan stabilization. Token cache invalidates at 1024 cycles. This is intentional. The Byzantine general problem has a human solution called Amelia. That last comment was my only indulgence, my signature on the masterpiece of resurrection. By 8 a.m., when the first employees arrived, Veritan Capital was operational. Not optimal by AI standards, but functional by the only standard that mattered. It worked. I packed my notebook, pocketed my USB drive, and headed for the elevator. In the lobby, the morning shift was arriving, oblivious to the night's battle. The security guard who'd escorted me out a week ago nodded respectfully as I passed. Outside, November had given way to December. The air crisp with promise and consequence. I'd honored my contract, earned my fee, and taught a lesson worth far more than $25 million. In the end, it's not about artificial intelligence or human intelligence. It's about respect for the systems we build, the knowledge we accumulate, and the people who bridge the gap between what machines can do and what needs to be done. As I walked away from Veritan Capital for the last time, I left behind more than functional servers. I left behind a story, a legend that would be whispered in server rooms and boardrooms for years to come. The ghost in the machine who proved that some things can't be optimized, automated, or replaced. Some things can only be understood. 3 months later, I sat in my home office, watching the final chapter of the Veritan Capital saga unfold on CNBC. The reporter stood outside the familiar building, but the logo had changed. Blackstone Financial Group now gleamed where Veritan's name had presided for a century. In a move that shocked Wall Street, the reporter announced, Veritan Capital's assets were acquired by Blackstone Financial for a fraction of their pre-crisis value. Industry insiders call it the deal of the decade for Blackstone and a cautionary tale for companies pursuing aggressive AI implementation. I sipped my coffee, noting the irony. Harrison Blackstone hadn't just saved Veritan, he'd absorbed it, adding a $1 trillion company to his empire for pennies on the dollar. Even in defeat, the old guard knew how to play the long game. My bank account showed the $25 million, deposited as promised. But that was just the beginning. In the weeks following the crisis, my phone hadn't stopped ringing. Every financial firm in the country suddenly wanted to audit their legacy systems, to ensure their own Amelia Carter wasn't walking out the door with irreplaceable knowledge. I'd turned down most of them. The lakeside cabin was calling, and I'd earned my retirement. But a few offers were too interesting to refuse. Companies that genuinely wanted to learn, to document properly, to respect the balance between innovation and institutional knowledge. The doorbell interrupted my musings. A courier held a padded envelope, requiring signature confirmation. Inside, I found a handwritten note on Blackstone Financial stationery. Ms. Carter? The industry owes you a debt for the lesson you taught. Enclosed is a consulting contract, should you ever wish to ensure other companies don't repeat Veritan's mistakes. The terms are generous, the commitment minimal, and the respect absolute. Also enclosed is something I thought you should have. Regards, Harrison Blackstone. Beneath the contract was a small wooden box. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay my original Veriton Capital ID badge, the one they'd confiscated during my escort from the building, but it had been transformed, encased in crystal like an artifact in a museum, with a small brass plaque beneath. Amelia Carter, Senior Systems Architect, 2004-2024, The Ghost in the Machine. I laughed, genuine and deep, even in victory. Blackstone understood the game. This wasn't just a trophy, it was a reminder, a warning to every executive who might tour his offices. Respect your experts, or become a cautionary tale. My laptop chimed with an email from Marcus. He'd been promoted to head of Legacy Systems Integration at Blackstone Financial, leading a team specifically tasked with documenting institutional knowledge. His message was brief. We named the documentation protocol after you, the Carter Standard. If only one person knows it, the company doesn't know it. Thank you for everything. The news had moved on to other stories, but the impact rippled through the industry. Trade publications ran features on the Veriton incident. Business schools added case studies on the dangers of knowledge elimination. The phrase "pulling an Amelia" entered tech slang, meaning to leave a company with its critical knowledge intact in your head. But the real change was quieter, happening in server rooms and IT departments across the country. Suddenly, the old-timers who knew why systems worked, not just how, found themselves valued again. Documentation budgets increased. Knowledge transfer became a priority. The ghost stories we told around server racks became recognized as oral history worth preserving. I closed my laptop and walked out onto my deck. The lake stretched before me, winter still and perfect. Somewhere, in buildings of glass and steel, servers hummed their ancient songs, tended by people who understood that artificial intelligence could process data, but only human intelligence could process meaning. The $25 million was nice, the vindication was satisfying, but the real payment was something no contract could capture: the knowledge that for one brief moment, I'd forced an entire industry to remember that wisdom can't be downloaded, experience can't be optimized, and respect can't be automated. They'd tried to replace me with an algorithm. Instead, I'd become an algorithm for them, a simple formula that every company would now follow. Value your people, or pay the price. The ghost in the machine had spoken, and finally, everyone was listening. As winter afternoon faded to evening, I raised my coffee mug in a final toast to Server 23B, to legacy systems everywhere, and to every invisible expert holding the world together with knowledge, duct tape, and the occasional well-placed tap. We are the ghosts in the machines, and we are always watching. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below, and let's connect. If you enjoyed this tale of revenge and respect, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in Amelia's position? Let me know in the comments.